Numbers and graphs and trend lines don't capture everyone's imagination. I understand that. But there is a story here that sets the stage for everything else we're going to talk about this semester. Let me give you an example from our own pre-field training days before we moved to China. I always thought of China as a communist country, as in full of communists. Anybody else feel that way? Not an unreasonable, thanks Mike. Not an unreasonable expectation. Imagine my surprise when I began to look at statistics and I learned that only 3% of the Chinese people were part of the Communist Party, which means 97%, despite economic incentives, had decided not to join. That radically changed how I felt about the people that we were called to serve. As you listen to Dr. Moeser, you may find yourself a little bit overwhelmed. There are many challenges facing our region, and that's okay. Allow me to encourage you not to pull back emotionally, mentally, spiritually into the slice of Richmond you find most comfortable. The challenges are overwhelming, but we do not serve a God who is easily overwhelmed. In fact, we serve a God who specializes in brokenness. Part of the reason I asked you to read the book of Nehemiah this week, a little obscure story, is to be encouraged by the challenges that Nehemiah faced and the way that God was faithful to Nehemiah and his community when they sought the Shalom of Jerusalem. I've also placed on the tables a week-by-week kind of a syllabi for the rest of the class. And this will help you get a sense of where we're headed, including when we're going to have field trips so that you can start to plan. We're going to tackle, as you'll see, some pretty tough issues, both in our community and in our hearts. And I just ask that you, along with me, continue to pray that God would keep your heart tender. You will also find a sheet that has this week's homework here. There are 3 parts to the homework this week. The first is to talk to your family about what you hear this morning. The second is to talk to, 4 parts. The second is to talk to someone outside your family about what you hear this morning. The third is to read a report called Deadline in Richmond, which studies an era in our history around the 1930s, and actually Dr. Moeser was instrumental in bringing that research together, and it dovetails very nicely with what he's going to talk about this morning. And the last thing is to read the introduction to generous justice. And there are a few questions to begin thinking about for our class. So I know it's a lot of homework this week, but we're heading into our first debrief next Sunday, and I want to make sure that we have a lot of good material to talk about. So, without further ado, I'm going to just offer a brief prayer and then introduce Dr. Moeser. Father, this morning, I thank you for the opportunity to learn more about the city that you have called us to. And Lord, our prayer this morning is that we would decrease, that you would increase. That in everything that we do, we would become more like your Son, Jesus Christ, in whose name we pray. Amen. Dr. Moeser is a professor emeritus of urban studies at Virginia Commonwealth University, where he taught for over 34 years. Currently, he is the Senior Fellow at the Bonner Center for Civic Engagement at the University of Richmond. His academic pursuits focus on urban affairs and metropolitan and regional government and politics. His books and other publications concentrate on post-World War II racial politics in Richmond, Virginia, city-suburban relationships, and poverty in Central Virginia. I can think of no person better qualified to help us have some new books for the information we're learning than Dr. Moeser.
Now, the area that I'm focusing on is the Richmond Regional Planning District. It is comprised of the City of Richmond, and then there are 7 counties: Chesterfield, Henrico, Hanover, kind of on the north-south axis, Goochland and Powhatan, the far west, New Kent and Charles City in the far east. Now, I'm not including the town of Ashland. I'm only looking at the city and the counties. Now, the poverty, the latest thresholds indicate that a person of 4 lives in poverty if their total cash income for the year, can y'all see this okay? If their total cash income for the year is $22,314 or less. And then you can see how it breaks down for an individual. Someone under the age of 65, if that person's total cash income is $11,344 or less, they live in poverty. Over 65, it's about $1,000 less, $10,458. And by the way, when the formula for the derivation of poverty was developed in the early 60s, it was assumed that older people like me needed less income. And again, today it's a very antiquated formula. I won't get into the specifics, but the formula has not changed. And by the way, these thresholds do not account for cost of living. The same thresholds apply if you're living in Manhattan or San Francisco or whether you're living in Lubbock, Texas. So the way that the census first develops this framework for measuring poverty, and then secondly, developing these thresholds, they are way out of date. Just about this time last year, the Weldon Cooper Center for Public Service at the University of Virginia, in my view, the state's preeminent public policy center in the Commonwealth, did a study of human need for Virginia. And they said that for a household of 4 to have just a self-sufficient income, you need to double the poverty thresholds. That is to say that for a family of 4, just to barely be self-sufficient, you need a minimum of $44,000. And they go on to say that anything less than 2 times the poverty rate, anything less than 2 times the poverty rate, 22,000 plus, puts families in a precarious position, because it only takes one calamity to send that family into a downward spiral to the point that they are completely bereft of all resources. A divorce, a lost job, serious health problems. Any one of those 3, if one is at double the poverty rate, can really be calamitous for a family. And they were talking about the amount of human need just here in Virginia. So I want you folks to keep this in mind when we look at figures dealing, first of all, with the very antiquated way that poverty is even defined, and then secondly, these very low thresholds. By the way, a lot of nonprofit organizations, to get a better idea of the extent of poverty, again, will double the rates. Now, currently, by the way, just to give you some idea, these are the 8 localities, the 7 counties in the city of Richmond. These are census years, 1990, 2000, 2009, by the way. And I wanted to do the 2009, 2010 just so that you could see the changes. These are 5-year estimates. I won't get into how Unfortunately, the Census Bureau is not using the long form anymore to count poverty, which is really unfortunate. It's based on a sample, and so it increases the unreliability of a lot of the data. The census is coming out with 1-year estimates, 3-year estimates, and 5-year estimates. These are 5-year estimates from 2005 to 2009. This is what came out in December. These are 5-year estimates from 2006 to 2010. So at any rate, if let's go to 2009, look at the city of Richmond. Richmond is the red column. In 2009, and that's the figure that I was using most often in this presentation, the poverty rate in the city of Richmond exceeded 1/5 of the population, 22.1%. But in December, it had climbed upwards to 25.3%. It's now over 1/4. Most of us who've been following these trends didn't, before this new release in December occurred, we were never in doubt that the poverty rate was going to increase. It was simply a matter of by how much. And what you're seeing in these 2000 figures now, and we're going to begin to see more of this, but this is really the first time you begin to see reflected in census data the impact of the recession. A lot of people have lost their jobs, and what you find now is kind of an invisible poverty, in that you've got middle-income people, in some cases even upper-middle income professionals who've lost their job, they've lost their benefits, they've lost their house, or if they haven't lost their house, they're barely hanging on to the house. And all you have to do is to interview anybody. For example, let's take free health care, whether it's the Fan-Free Clinic, whether it is crossover ministry, or whether it's Access Now, which is free health care provided by the Richmond Academy of Medicine. And they will all tell you that the people who are walking into these free clinics now are people who never before had done that because they had health coverage. They don't anymore. And folks who are who've crashed are living in middle-income neighborhoods. I suspect many here in this neighborhood, you wouldn't be aware of it at all. And so the depth of poverty now has really, really spread. There still is, and I'll talk about this, an area of the city where you have high density poverty. And it's also true in Chesterfield and in Rikers, and I'll show you some maps about that in just a moment. By the way, talk about numbers of poor just in the city of Richmond. The number of poor living in the city of Richmond equates to the student body of VCU, which is the second largest university in the state of Virginia, plus the University of Virginia. Now, if you combine the two student bodies, a UVA and VCU, that's the number of people who are poor just in the city of Richmond. It's incredible. Richmond has the highest poverty rate ever. Since the formula was developed by the census in the early 60s, naturally the first census after that was 1970. So that's where you began. This is the first time the census began to include poverty as a separate category. And so if we start in 1970, this is the trend line for the city of Richmond. And with the exception of this decade, between 1990 and 2000, by the way, a lot of percentages went down there. I attribute that to a large, those were the boom years. That's when we were really riding high. The stock market was up, and employment was up, and the poverty rate went down a bit. And that's not an exception for other localities. But with that exception, the trend in Richmond had just been going steadily upward. And then you can see from 2000 to 2010, it really has soared upward. This one is even more discouraging. Children, defined as people from literally at birth to 18. And right now, by the way, 2009, child poverty exceeded 1/3. It was 35%. But look at it now. It is 38.7%. We're getting close to 40%. 40% of all of the children in the city of Richmond living in poverty. Keep in mind now, the determination of poverty is way low. It doesn't encompass the full amount of human need. What size percentage would that be if we had a more accurate measurement of poverty? And by the way, one thing I'd like to say about child poverty, this is a group where poverty strikes with particular cruelty. Because particularly, even before birth, if a mother is not getting proper nutrition, the development of the child, as we know, can be very much affected. And then at birth, without proper health care, proper nutrition, that child can be behind before they even start preschool. And then when they get in elementary school, they'll just simply fall farther behind and farther behind until finally a lot will just drop out. And then the streets capture them. It's tragic. And so much of this could be addressed with proper nutrition. But first with enough food, and then nutritious food, health care. And by the way, one of the characteristics of highly concentrated poverty neighborhoods is that they are food deserts. That there are no grocery stores, there are little markets where the selection is sparse, where the prices are high and the food is not nutritious. And they can't get to the grocery stores. Many do walk. Even elderly people will walk a long way to the grocery store and then carry the groceries back to their house. This is... Now, what also is particularly interesting, I think, for Bon Air Church is that the poverty rates in Richmond are at an all-time high. But where the highest percentages of growth in the poverty population are occurring are in the counties. Henrico has the largest percent increase. If you simply look at the number of poor people, let's say in 2000 compared to the number of poor people today, then in Henrico it was a 78% increase in this last decade. In Chesterfield County, 55%. So the percentage increases are much, much more noticeable in the counties. Currently, if you look at the poverty population and you break it out by jurisdiction, Richmond has the single largest slice of the pie at 48%. Chesterfield is 18%. This is Henrico at 28%. What might surprise you, however, is if you look at the poverty population and simply split it between city and suburb, then you will find that there are more people living in poverty who reside in the suburbs than in the city. This was found to be the case only about 4 years ago. In fact, what's happening in Richmond is happening all across the United States. The Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. has been tracking this, and all across the nation now, there are more poor people residing in the suburbs than in the city, which is far different than the bulk of our national history, far different than the history we've had right here in Richmond. Another thing that I was interested in was looking at median household income in census tracts. A census tract is a geographic unit usually comprised of 2 or 3 neighborhoods. And I was interested in looking at the disparity between wealth and poverty, looking at the census tracts that were very wealthy compared to the very poorest. And I did this in each of the jurisdictions. And actually, in Charles City and places like Goochland, the disparity between the wealthiest census tract and the poorest is not that great. In Charles City, the wealthiest is 1.2 times that of the poorest. Chesterfield is 5.6 to 1. In Richmond City, it is 17 to 1. The single wealthiest census tract is 17 times wealthier than the poorest. If you look at the single wealthiest, and by the way, the wealthiest census tract in Richmond is Windsor Farms. In the next slide, I will have a photo of Windsor Farms. And by the way, the single poorest census tract in Richmond is also the single poorest tract for all of Central Virginia. Anybody hazard a guess what that tract might be? What's in that tract? Gilpin Court, yes. It's Gilpin Court. So the difference in wealth between Windsor Farms and Gilpin Court is 17 to 1. If you look at the single wealthiest tract in Central Virginia, it's not Windsor Farms. There's one tract that's wealthier than that, and that is a tract that begins at the Country Club of Virginia. And then if you are traveling west on River Road, beginning at the Country Club, and head all the way to Goochland, the territory between River Road and the James River, that is the single wealthiest tract. And when you compare that to Gilpin Court, then it is 21 to 1. What Matthew did was to plot a route that one could take if you were driving from Windsor Farms to Gilpin Court. That you'd leave Windsor Farms and then you would, right here, leave Windsor Farms, just drive down Carey Street, and then this is Belvedere, and you turn left on Belvedere. Anyway, this is a route map, and then you get to Gilpin Court. And the distance separating Windsor Farms from Gilpin Court is only 3.5 miles. If you looked at the distance as the crow flies, what are we talking about? 2 miles maybe 2.5 miles? And yet, these are two entirely different worlds. By the way, I played on a title of a book that was released about a year ago. Have any of you even heard about or more particularly read the book 5 Miles Away, A World Apart? Have you heard about it? It was published by Oxford University Press. And it was published by a professor of law at the University of Virginia. And it talks about school segregation. I blanked on his name. It'll come to me in just a moment. But at any rate, it focuses on school segregation in the United States. It's one of the best, most encompassing records of what's happened really since the Brown decision until now in schools all across the United States. But he uses as the kind of framework for the book a case study. The case study focuses on 2 high schools. One is Douglas Freeman, and the other one is Thomas Jefferson. So that's the reason you might want to read the book, because the case study really pertains to the Richmond metropolitan area. And so the title of the book, 5 Miles Away, A World Apart, I use that for this slide. But these really are different worlds. For example, every summer, the University of Richmond will hire young people in the city for summer jobs. And before their summer jobs begin, they'll work with the grounds crew or might work with construction or whatever it might be. But before their jobs start, they will come out to UR for an orientation. And of course, UR will provide transportation for them and take them to UR. And I've seen some of the youngsters that will go through the Tyler Haynes Student Commons building, and they've never seen the University of Richmond before. And they are just amazed. It's like Dorothy in the Land of Oz. They've never seen such a sight. And meanwhile, there are not many people in Windsor Farms. There are not many people in West End There are not a lot of people, regardless of the neighborhood, middle income, particularly middle income, upwards, whites, who've ever been in Gilpin Court. In fact, unlike Windsor Farms, Gilpin Court has this great big sign right out in front that says danger. So you avoid Gilpin Court. By the way, I have spoken to groups that have included Gilpin Court residents or people who used to live in Gilpin Court. There are young people, this is hard to believe, but there are young people in the city of Richmond who've never been to the James River until a group of adults, usually through a nonprofit organization, will take them and take them on a canoe trip or a raft trip, or take them fishing or walking along the nature trails in the James River Park. But the isolation, my wife taught, she was a high school English teacher. She retired the same year from the Richmond Public Schools that I did from VCU. She taught junior English. She completed her career at Armstrong High School. Most of her career, though, was at George Wythe High School. And she's a lot stronger, by the way, and I'm not just being facetious. She's much stronger physically and emotionally than I am. I could not have done what she did over so many years, but oh gosh, the stories that she would bring home are heartbreaking. They were absolutely heartbreaking. And it just pointed out over and over again these little tiny, tiny worlds that so many of the children in Richmond live in. I'm going to speed this up a little bit so that we've got some time for questions. When you break poverty, when you look at the poverty population, break it down by race, 46% is black, 39% white, 11% Latino. I'm going to just rush over that one quick. This is an interesting table. It doesn't look all that interesting, but it says a lot about the differences in poverty. Black poverty is different from white. White is different from Latino. For example, white poverty traditionally, and still is, largely suburban poverty. If you look at all poor whites, 67% live in the suburbs. And because it is low density poverty, it's not highly concentrated, white poverty is not as visible. However, black poverty is just the reverse. Historically, and still is, it's largely city. In fact, these percentages are almost reversed. 61% of the black poor live in the city, 39% in the suburbs. And also, secondly, this is another big difference, and that is black poverty is high-density poverty. It is concentrated. Asian poverty is similar to white. It's low density primarily, suburban. Latino poverty is like white poverty in that it too, Latino, is suburban to a large extent, but it's like black poverty in that it also is highly dense, very, very concentrated. You see Latino poverty, particularly in the south side of Richmond. I took these photos along Route 1. By the way, a lot of Latinos live in trailer parks. What you may not know is that a single trailer or mobile home might be divided into 2 or even 3 little cubicles called cabanas. I've spoken to groups that have included social workers from the Chesterfield County schools, and they will make home visits. They've been inside these trailers, they've seen the cubicles, whole families will live in a cabana. Now, this is, of all the slides, this is perhaps one of the most interesting. And this is a slide that looks at all census tracts where 20% or more of the people live in poverty. And I said that Latino and African American poverty is highly dense, highly concentrated. This is high density poverty that is racially defined. Black poverty is very dense, very concentrated, particularly in East and North Side Richmond. When you cross the river, you also have African American poverty, but that's where you really begin to see, as you noticed just in the previous slide, Latino poverty. By the way, this is an anomaly. That's Goochland County, and that census tract is Mannequin Sabbath, which is one of the wealthiest tracts in the whole region. How in the world did this get to be a high poverty tract? Because the Census Bureau counts prisons. And so there are 2 state prisons in this census tract. And you know, I thought about actually redoing this map and actually taking out that tract just so that we could focus on that. But then I said, no, I don't want to do that. And the reason I don't want to do that is, in a way, those two prisons where the inmates are counted by the Census Bureau, those prisons, in a sense, are metaphors for that. One way to define poverty, and it has been defined this way, are people who have no choice, who have no opportunity. They're stuck, they're confined, and they can't get out. And if there's any movement at all, often it's from one poor neighborhood to another poor neighborhood. And there is movement. By the way, if one reason that you have such concentrated poverty here is that when Richmond years ago started participating in the public housing program, all of the public housing in Richmond over a period of time was put in East End and North Side. There's only one public housing community in South Side. All of the other is east of Chamberlain. And by the way, if you go back to that first slide with the bullseye, you could take a ruler essentially and draw a straight line down Route 1, Chamberlain Avenue on the north side of the river, Jeff Davis Highway on the south side of the river, just straight down. And on the north side, it is east of Chamberlain. And to give you an orientation, here's Gilpin Court, that's Chamberlain Avenue. This is Interstate 60, this is Interstate 95, and then you come to the fork where you can either take 64 and go to Williamsburg, or you you take 95 south to Petersburg, so that gives you some frame of reference. But look at all that public housing packed into there. Actually, there are 3 parts to my presentation. I purposely left out the second part because we just wouldn't have enough time. But the second part deals with why is it that so much density was built up in East End. Well, I mentioned one thing, and it was where all of the public housing was placed. But there is a very tragic history, in addition to public housing, that has led to this bullseye. And actually, you don't even have to start with the 19th century. You can start with 1937. A lot of people are not aware of what happened in the city of Richmond, actually in cities across the United States, from the mid-30s to only recently. And that's, in fact, I will say that we have concentrated poverty because we planned it that way. It was not an accident. It was quite deliberate. And by the way, people in my profession, many years ago, planners were deeply implicated in that. Just don't have the time to go into it, but it is a great tragedy. And a lot of people are not aware of it. African Americans, when I've spoken to African American audiences, they immediately, when I began to kind of tell the story, including how Interstate 95 went right through the middle of Jackson Ward, that was purposeful, you'll see them nodding their heads. They know this history well. For a lot of white audiences, they're not familiar with the things that took the more recent history. highway building, urban renewal, slum clearance, just one thing after another. Now, quickly jumping to jobs and then to what can we do about it. From this point on, a lot of the data come from the Virginia Employment Commission. This simply looks at the share of all of the jobs in Central Virginia that are in each locality. Take Richmond, for example, in 1990, 45% of all the metropolitan jobs were in Richmond. It's just gone steadily downward. Now it's only 30%. Between 1990 and 2010, the whole region gained 82,000 jobs. What is seldom reported in the press is while the region gained 82,000, the city lost 40,000. And even the period in the last 10 years, the region gained 4,800, and while the region gained 4,800, the city lost 18,000. And the city lost all kinds of jobs. High wage, middle wage, and low wage. So here you have this concentrated poverty. You've got the bullseye, people who are desperate for jobs. Meanwhile, you've got the jobs outside the city limits. And so and by the way, I'm on the Mayor's Anti-Poverty Commission, and one of the things that we're addressing is this spatial mismatch between those who really need jobs and employers, where most of the employers are located. Well, obviously, one way to do it is just get a car, but the problem is the census actually counts automobiles. 18.2% of all the households in the city don't own a car, 18.2%. And then when you add the number of households, and I'm talking households now, not individuals, that only have one car, it zooms upward to 60%. No car at all. Well, that means you've got to ride the bus. That's assuming, however, that the bus gets you to where the jobs are so plentiful. This is a map of GRTC lines. The dark lines represent bus lines. The light purple represent walking distance to the bus stop. The turquoise circles represent employers. The larger the circle, the larger number of jobs. And it's a very self-explanatory map. Look at all of these jobs, all of these employers that are beyond the bus lines. So you don't have a car, you can't rely on the bus. What do you do? And by the way, one of the things that I'm on the Transportation and Regionalism Committee of the Anti-Poverty Commission. And we've been working with the Richmond Regional Planning District, their staff, as well as the staff of GRTC. And there has been developed a regional public transit plan with 5 major arteries. It's a spoke and hub system going out to 288 all around Richmond. It has not yet gone public. We first have got to talk with each of the county governing boards. And we had more time to talk, and that's where we're going to need all hands on deck. The faith community is so important in that, and getting well, another way to close the gap is if you can't ride the bus, you don't have a car. You know, in the old city, the 19th century city, it was highly dense. It was mixed use, which meant that you had residential interspersed with commercial, interspersed with institutional like schools and what. So you could walk to school, you could walk to work, and that's how people got around. So one thing that we can focus on is mixed use, where you've got access to work within a short distance of where you live. But the problem right now is that there is very little of that, particularly not mixed use, but what we need with mixed use is mixed income communities. And you don't really see that. Affordable housing is at a crisis. And to give you some idea, the market rent for simply a 2-bedroom apartment, right now, market rent, $958. If you don't spend more than a third of your income for rent, you need an annual income of $38,000. And did you know that 30% of all state employees earn less than $35,000? What kind of hourly wage do you need in order to afford that two-bedroom apartment? $18.40. The average wage, in fact, is $14.17. And with this, I'll close. The only other way to close that gap is drive economic development back into the city, back into those poverty neighborhoods. But the city is old, it's small, and it's landlocked. Most of the land is developed. The city became a city back in the 18th century. It's also a little tiny place. Despite the annexations over the years, the city only has 60 square miles compared to Chesterfield's 434, Hanover's 468 square miles. And now the city has lost its powers to annex. So it's stuck. And so if a developer wants to come into the city and open a new business or a small manufacturing plant, which would be good entry-level jobs, that person in all likelihood is going to have to clear a brownfield, an industrial site. And that's going to cost a whole lot more money than going out to Hanover County, buying a greenfield and starting immediately. You could save money. So those are the challenges before us, and this is when we're supposed to be going, Sarah. So maybe what you can do is pack all this information together so that, I don't know what your Sunday next week is, you could talk about it.
Yes,
do we have time maybe for a couple of quick questions? Okay. I hate to leave that question. Yes.
John, what's going on in Charles City County? I noticed from the graphs that kind of drops precipitously with poverty rates and things of that nature. So in contrast to most of the other rates.
Well, the same thing is happening in Charles City that is happening in East End Richmond. By the way, that bullseye map, I just talked about the red. There's some yellow census tracts that I didn't really get into. Those are census tracts that used to be in high poverty and no longer are. There are parts of Church Hill, Highland Park, Chimborazo, Fulton. These are historic neighborhoods and they're gentrifying. Same thing is happening in Charles City. People are moving out to Charles City, and people who are moving out have money. And so that's reducing the poverty out in Charles City. Other questions? Yes?
Make available to Sarah for us to read about the history portion that you had to omit today. I'm sure that's very touching and revealing. So.
Sure. Now, it includes a lot of photographs. And so there's not a narrative, unfortunately, but it is photographs. But it'll give you photographs of the early stages of 95, what happened with the Downtown Expressway. It'll show you what happened with Navy Hill. Navy Hill is gone. It's obliterated. You may not have ever heard of Navy Hill. It was a very cohesive black community on the east side of Jackson Water. And that was the product of the expansion of MCV, the Coliseum, City Hall, and most recently, the last nail in the coffin was the Biotech Research Park. Navy Hill was gone. But yeah, I'd be happy to share that with you. If you just remind me, Sarah. Maybe one more. Yes, sir.
Did you ever know Patience Blooms?
Yes. Well, I didn't know her personally, but I know the book. Yes, I know her.
You ever met her?
No, I didn't. Did you know her?
I met the children.
You did?
But the neighborhood, when I moved in, was still there. And it was very interesting. It was a functioning neighborhood. It was a little off the bus line.
Yes.
But it was not degrading poverty.
No.
Primarily because of her and her knack for selecting good leaders and the church care and so forth. Once the city moved in and obliterated it, people were scattered into, where. Now today, that neighborhood has been rebuilt. And this is the funny thing. This is my fourth slum I lived in. This is the one that has recovered. And I don't know, there's something about Richmond that seems to rejuvenate itself much better than, let's say, the Bronx.
Yeah. Oh, wow. You're familiar with the book, I'm sure, about what happened to Fulton. It was obliterated. It was supposed to be an industrial park, as you know, the industrial park. There is development now. In fact, one of the slides, what's your name? Pilar. Is a slide of Fulton. There is some developments. It looks kind of like suburban housing, but Fulton in its heyday was a city within a city. I have an old 19th century photograph of Fulton. It was marvelous. But there's a book that talks about what happened in Fulton. And it was tragic. It was just impatience numbs. In fact, the title of the book is, I think, The World of Patience Numbs. But I never met her. So you met her. Wow.
I met the children.
Met the children.
I was a little late.
Oh, okay.
What a difference it meant.
Oh.
When you had an inspirational leader.
That's right. That's
You had poverty, but you had care also.
That's right. You know, you point out something that's very important. You can see an impoverished neighborhood, and now take Gilpin Court, for example. There's a strong social network in Gilpin Court. That is in many ways their survival. They know each other, care for each other, and so when you talk about just obliterating a neighborhood, there go the social supports, the networks that they've built up personally through a lot of ingenuity. But they're really a community within a community. I'm going to have to stop. I've gone way, way over. But I do want to thank you again for having this series. And I wish you well, and thanks again for inviting me.